So welcome everyone. I'm Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. We're based in Guelph, which I gratefully acknowledge is in the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And it's a huge pleasure and privilege today to have our Sentience mini-series opened by Dr. Jonathan Birch. Jonathan is a philosopher at the London School of Economics and Political Science who has simply galvanized academic and societal interest in animal sentience, its distribution, and its ethical and legal implications. He's been particularly impactful through some influential work on invertebrate sentience, which led to the legal status of decapods and cephalopods being changed in the UK. And he's also been influential through training some fantastic younger philosophers like Heather Browning and Andrew Crump. So Jonathan did a PhD at Cambridge University, followed by a junior research fellowship at Christ College. He joined LSE in 2014, when he was also awarded a prestigious Philip Leverhulme Prize for his recognition of his academic excellence. So we're incredibly lucky to have him here today. Jonathan's going to give us an introduction to sentience, and then I'm going to follow with the case for sentience in mammals and birds. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Georgia. It was a very kind introduction. I think what actually excites me about this event is not that I'm talking at it, but that it's a double act and that I'm only going to talk briefly and then we're going to hear from Georgia. And I think my views in the past have had an interesting mix of agreement and disagreement with Georgia. So I'm very intrigued to hear what you have to say and whether I agree with it. I think on this occasion, maybe I will, given that your topic is mammals. So that the brief for me was to introduce this webinar series on the topic of animal sentience by introducing the concepts of sentience and how I think we can find out about it. It's been a real pleasure of mine since 2020 to be leading a group at the LSE called the Foundations of Animal Sentience Project, where our goals have been, firstly, to develop better methods for studying the subjective experiences of animals scientifically, and secondly, finding new ways of putting the emerging science of animal sentience to work to design better policies, laws, and ways of caring for animals. You can find a link to all of our work at the bottom of the slide there. Now in Zoom, you can't click on links that just appear when someone's sharing their screen. But if you want to bring up any of these slides in your own browser window, just go to bit.ly/Birch CCSAW as described in the top right there. And then when you bring them up in a browser window, you'll be able to click the links as well. So I think part of the motivation for my project, there's always a scientific motivation and a philosophical motivation, but also an ethical/legal motivation as well. We're about 200 years in at this point to the story of animal welfare law. The first ever animal welfare law explicitly written into law was in Britain in 1822. It was called Martin's Act. It ruled out certain acts of cruelty towards cattle that were being taken to market in London. There's this famous drawing of one of the first prosecutions that was brought under the Act, where the lawyer who'd campaigned very hard for it, Richard Martin, literally brought a donkey into court to show the extent of the donkey's injuries. I think over those 200 years, well, there's been a mix of progress and things getting worse, I suppose. One of the things that's arguably a form of progress is that the scope of animal welfare law has broadened out in many different dimensions. It's partly broadened out taxonomically from a situation where it was just covering specific livestock animals to one where now, as Georgia mentioned, some laws include not just all vertebrates, including fish, but also some invertebrates like octopuses, crabs, and lobsters. That seems like progress to me. And in fact, my team's advice was very influential in shaping the UK's most recent animal welfare law, the Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022, that does extend a basic duty on all policymakers to respect animals as sentient beings, including octopuses, crabs, lobsters. I think there's been another kind of broadening too, a certain kind of conceptual broadening in what aspects of our behavior towards animals we should want to regulate, where that early focus on cruelty and the really absolute worst things that people do to animals has given way to this much broader idea of sentience and the idea of respecting and recognizing other animals as sentient beings with lives of their own to lead. And it's really in that context that my project has got started. We've been very interested in sentience and how to study it, where Jeremy Bentham more than 200 years ago was saying the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? I think many would now say, are they sentient? Where this is a deliberately broader concept. Sentience, as I think of it, for some people, it's just the capacity to have any subjective experience at all, even if it was completely neutral, like an experience of color or sound or a completely neutral odor. But usually in discussions of animal welfare and animal ethics, it's defined a little more narrowly than that, as the capacity to have experiences with a positive or negative quality. Experiences such as pain, pleasure, comfort, discomfort, boredom, excitement, contentment, frustration, anxiety, joy, states that either feel bad or feel good to the subject that has them. It's a good concept because it's trying to shift our focus beyond just suffering and moreover beyond just pain and pleasure as well, to include these more subtle phenomena like frustration, contentment, excitement. It's about having feelings, there being something it feels like to be you. It's not about more sophisticated capacities like the ability to reflect on your feelings or the ability to understand your own feelings or the feelings of others. These more complicated things are things that a lot of us humans struggle with a lot of the time. And sentience is not supposed to be about that. It's supposed to be about simply having the feelings, whether you understand them or not. It implies consciousness in one sense of the word, but this word consciousness is very ambiguous, gets used in lots of different ways. And when we're talking about sentience, we're talking about what I think of as the most basic, elemental, probably the most evolutionarily ancient sense of that word, which is what philosophers like to call phenomenal consciousness, experience. The fact that there is something it's like to be you, that you have this subjective point of view on the world and on your own body that makes it possible for you to feel things like pain and pleasure and anxiety and joy. And it's become a favored term lately in animal law in many countries around the world, not just the UK, but Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Lots of discussion of it. I think mainly because in contrast to pain and suffering and cruelty, it includes the positive side of mental life as well as the negative. In respecting animals as sentient beings, we're implicitly thinking of them as beings that have their own lives to lead, including all the positive stuff as well. And when we're trying to give them good lives, that doesn't just mean ameliorating their pain, but also giving them some things to enjoy, giving them some positive states as well. So I'm a fan of the concept. I think it's right that it's become so important. If you want to read more about the concept of sentience, I did an introduction in a journal called Philosophy Compass with Heather Browning last year, and there's a link to that on the slides, and the link to the slides is in the bottom right corner there. So I'm going to shift from the concept of sentience, which I've now introduced, to the question of how we can get a science of animal sentience going, what our approach is going to be when we're trying to study this scientifically and trying to go beyond our intuitive reactions. Intuitively, we think our pets are sentient, of course we do, but we're often inclined to dismiss the idea in other animals like insects or crabs. And we need to get beyond our intuitive reactions to actually develop scientific ways of adjudicating these matters. And that's what my whole project has been about. One place to start is with other humans, because we're in an area here where we can't achieve absolute certainty that brooks no doubt whatsoever. Because we're talking about subjective experience, we can entertain doubts even when it comes to other humans. This is called in philosophy the problem of other minds. how do you rule out solipsism? How do you rule out the idea that you're the only sentient being in the universe? How do I know that anyone except me is sentient? And in fact, most of us don't worry about this all that much. I think the reason we don't worry about it is that there's perfectly good ways to infer that the people around us have sentience. We use what we might think of as the principle of inference to the best explanation. The idea that in doing science, we're not limited to purely deductive arguments. We also have the ability to construct explanations for sets of data that we see. And when something provides a very good explanation of our data, we're entitled to believe it if it's better than all of the other explanations we can come up with. That principle, I think, is widely used in many areas of science. In fact, one of my first supervisors, Peter Lipton, wrote a book called Inference to the Best Explanation, portraying it as something very, very fundamental to many different areas of science. Let's think of an example from a totally different area of science, from paleontology. What caused the extinction of the dinosaurs? Well, that's not a question we're going to be able to answer through deductive argument. We're going to have to look at all the evidence and think about what the best explanation of that evidence is. So scientists found various different pieces of evidence. They found the global geological signature of an asteroid impact, the so-called iridium anomaly, that coincided with when the dinosaurs disappear from the fossil record. That was a bit of a clue. Then in the 1990s, they found a massive crater off the coast of Mexico and managed to date it to when the dinosaurs disappeared. And in fact, just 2021, scientists investigated, well, how closely did these line up in time? They've seen they're about the same point in the fossil record, but how close are they? And the most recent dating techniques date the global iridium anomaly, the signature of an asteroid impact, to within 20 years of the formation of this crater. So you're starting to get various different pieces of evidence, and you're doing detective work and coming up with explanations. And it really seems like when you put all the pieces together, the best explanation is a massive asteroid impact throwing up huge dust clouds, blocking out the sun, causing a global winter, killing dinosaurs. And we can think about what makes this better than other explanations you might come up with. You know, you could have another explanation about, I don't know, a killer virus or something that just wipes them all out. What gives us reason to believe this over the killer virus idea? I think there's many criteria we can use for evaluating different explanations of this kind. But note that with the killer virus idea, we don't have these various different pieces lining up. Okay, important idea for me in this area, but not just for me, also for Darwin, is an idea from the astronomer John Herschel that he called the Vera Causa principle, where in evaluating explanations, the good explanations are ones that cite causes whose existence and competence to produce the phenomenon of interest is supported by independent evidence. And that these explanations are better than those that cite causes of unknown existence or competence. So we have, in the asteroid case, very clear evidence, independently of us wanting to explain why the dinosaurs went extinct, that there was indeed an asteroid impact at that time, and that it produced this crater. And we can model the sort of size and force it would have needed to produce a crater of that size. And we can model, would that have been enough to create a global winter, and argue that it could. In contrast, the killer virus, well, this is imaginary in effect, because we've got no independent signatures that there was such a thing at the time. And so this seems like a clear case where the principle of inference to the best explanation says, well, one explanation is much better here, and we're justified in believing that one, as judged by normal scientific standards like the Vera Causa principle. And now to go back to the case of other minds, I think this is exactly the kind of reasoning we're using in those cases. Inference to the best explanation. If you're asking, do other humans have minds? Well, there's just tons of evidence. There's my own experiences. There's the observation that even though I can't see other people's experiences, I know they have brains like mine. that we're part of the same species, descended from a common ancestor. So know that when I report my experiences, other people can grasp what I'm talking about and report having much the same kinds of experience that I do. And moreover, that we talk all the time about the similarities and differences between our experiences. And you put all this together and you think, well, what are the different explanations here? Well, there's a very good simple one, which is that other people have experiences much like I do, but with many similarities to my own, plus some differences, which we're always talking about. Alternative explanations, well, maybe other people have large language models embedded in their heads that have been trained on all of my past reports of my experiences or something, and so they're mimicking exactly the way a human would report their experiences. But that doesn't really seem to meet the vera causa standard. It doesn't really seem like I have any evidence that people have these AIs in their heads. It doesn't seem to meet normal scientific standards. And so I think we'd all agree that in the human case, awake adult human, inference to the best explanation very strongly supports attributing conscious experiences. And I don't think really the situation is that different with a lot of other animals. Now, there are some differences. Now, I think animal sentience research, like many other sciences, like paleontology, and like common sense psychology, is founded on this idea of inference to the best explanation. But it does face these two distinctive challenges. One is that there's a big source of evidence we don't have in the case of other animals. A lot of that evidence I was describing in the human case, well, of course, it's verbal. And the science of human consciousness is still very heavily reliant on people's ability to verbally report what it is they've experienced. And we're just never going to have really that type of evidence for other animals. There's a lot of talk about, can we use AI technologies to decipher animal communication? Maybe we shouldn't rule out completely the idea that animals may one day be able to report what they're experiencing, but we don't currently have that sort of evidence. What we have is large amounts of neural evidence and large amounts of behavioral evidence. But then we run into this second challenge as well, which I think is more our focus today, that with behavioral evidence, we lack a firm grip on what it is that can be achieved wholly non-consciously. And this is a real challenge for the field. Think, for example, of simple reflexes, where you touch a hot stove, for example, with your hand, and your hand recoils. That reflex withdrawal of your hand is underway before there's any conscious experience of pain. The conscious experience comes later. It is doing something else. It is not initiating that reflex withdrawal. In fact, the spinal cord seems to play a hugely important role in coordinating these reflex responses to injury. The brain isn't involved at all. There's also phenomena like blind sight. Now, this, in contrast to reflex withdrawal of your hand, this is not a common experience at all, but it's rather something that happens when people have certain kinds of brain injury to a region at the back of the brain called the visual cortex. And you can get these phenomena where, because that region of the brain is damaged, there's part of the visual field where they report seeing absolutely nothing. They say that is a complete blank. It's as blank as the space behind my head. And I can't see anything there. And equally, I can't see anything in this region. And yet, when people give them tasks that require them to choose between two options, depending on what is in that region of the visual field, they can perform above chance. And in fact, there's really extreme cases of this where people with blind sight are nonetheless able to walk down a corridor, negotiating their way around obstacles that are presented in the blind region of their visual field. So it seems like not just reflex withdrawal, but quite a lot of routine behavioral control is occurring without any role for conscious experience. In a similar vein, you get cases of sleepwalking and very rare examples of epileptic seizures. Normally, epileptic seizures are immobilizing, but in very rare cases, they're not. And very strange things happen. There's an example, for example, of someone who has a kind of epilepsy where she had a seizure on her way to lunch with colleagues, recalls nothing of what happened during the seizure. When she regained consciousness, she'd found herself back in the office with a portion of chicken salad, which she doesn't like, for lunch. Her colleagues told her that she'd got out of the car and walked into a nearby restaurant where she never goes. The restaurant personnel told her that she'd not said anything, but had pointed to the salad, bought it, smiled, but avoided eye contact. Very striking example. Now, it's not, it could be that there was a conscious state there during the seizure, of which the subject has absolutely no memory. That's one possible explanation. But it could equally be that there was no conscious experience there at all, and that these routine behaviors of going in there, pointing at a random thing and buying it and smiling, these quite routine behaviors were all under non-conscious control. That's a possible explanation as well. And you might think when you combine that with the blind sight evidence, maybe that's a better explanation. So this is a big challenge to overcome, that it seems like you can't just say, well, all behavioral control requires consciousness. So whenever we see an animal engaging in complex behavior, it's obviously conscious. It seems as though that would be a mistake. There's an overexcited reaction to this that I think has been the reaction of people who really, really want to be extreme skeptics about animal sentience, which is to say, well, maybe sentience has absolutely no behavioral signatures at all. Maybe it's doing nothing for us. And I think that is a wild overreaction to these cases, because it's not that these people with epilepsy and blind sight and so on are just carrying on as normal, living their normal lives. They're in fact behaving very, very abnormally. And it seems like there's probably quite a lot that is under conscious control in a normal human life. What we're finding is that some mechanisms of behavioral control are independent of sentience, but not all of them. And it just pushes us to ask the question, what is missing? What is missing in reflex response, blind sight, sleepwalking, etc., that goes beyond all of these things and that does provide something that can be explained by the presence of sentience? And this is what a lot of the sort of theoretical discussions in animal sentience research are about trying to find those capacities that are good markers to look for, given that we can't just be looking for reflexes, we can't just be looking for complex behavior. We've got to look for something that goes beyond this. The most obvious candidates, I think, are, first of all, flexible value-guided decision-making. If you think about what was missing in that epilepsy case where the person ordered a salad that they didn't actually like, it seems like what was missing was the usual representations of value that guide our decision-making and that lead us to have to enjoy some things, to dislike others, and to favor the things we like and avoid the things we dislike. This flexible value-guided decision-making. A lot of experiments in the sort of animal sentience space explore that in different ways. And I think the other main obvious candidate is learning. Now, not just any learning, because the simplest kinds of classical conditioning, where you present, as in the Pavlov's dog's case, you present an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus like food and a bell simultaneously. And so all the animal has to do is learn an association between two concurrent stimuli. These seem to be so simple that the brain is arguably not always involved at all. And that even in cases where experimenters have disconnected the brain from the spinal cord in rats, it seems like the disconnected spinal cord can still do these simple kinds of conditioning. But there's more sophisticated kinds of learning that clearly seem to go beyond this. As soon as you introduce any temporal gap at all, in fact, so as soon as you're learning, for example, that a tone will predict a puff of air in your eye a second later, even if it's just a temporal gap of a second, this appears to be much, much harder and much, much more difficult to do without conscious experience of the stimuli and of the relation between them. So the overall picture that I think we get from human consciousness science is one that makes it very plausible that sentience in us facilitates a package of learning and decision-making abilities that overlay simpler, more ancient mechanisms of action control And sometimes we delegate, sometimes we just delegate very routine stuff to those lower level mechanisms of action control. But nonetheless, a lot of our more flexible and sophisticated behavior and learning does involve sentience. And then most of the research in the field into other animals is looking for precisely these kinds of markers, where you've got evidence from the human case that links that capacity to sentience. And then you're going and looking to see whether the other animals display those kinds of learning and those kinds of decision making. To me, this is it's far from the picture that angry skeptics sometimes present of the field as being characterized by credulous anthropomorphism, and people just going and looking and saying, well, that animal's cute, so it must be feeling things. I know the research as it actually is just the exact opposite of that. It's really, really sensitive to the evidence coming out of human consciousness science about what sorts of capacities might actually be facilitated by conscious experience. And it's structured around looking for those. And so I think when we get evidence of this type, it's genuinely pretty good evidence. And it can form the basis of an inference to the best explanation of fundamentally the same kind that we make when thinking of other human minds. Recall with other human minds, the evidence is completely overwhelming because there's just all of this stuff that can be very easily explained on the hypothesis that other humans have sentience just as I do, but that requires really weird, it's very hard to come up with an alternative explanation of any kind. And when we do, we realize it's wild and highly implausible. I think we can get to a very similar situation with other animals as well. The markers are never verbal, so there's never quite the same level of confidence. The markers have to be non-verbal, but that doesn't just mean we're credulously interpreting behavior in any way we want. We're looking for serious markers of this kind that are where sentience is the best explanation. The best explanation for these data is that those animals are sentient just as we are. Sometimes because we've descended from a common sentient ancestor, which I think is very probably the case with other mammals, but sometimes because they've evolved it separately by their own path from a common ancestor that may not have been sentient, which I think is very plausibly the case when it comes to octopuses. So this is the point to hand over to Georgia. Now, I've talked about the concept of sentience, and I've talked about the methodology we can use for gaining confidence about its presence in other animals. Not certainty, but confidence. And I'm going to hand over to Georgia, who is going to tell us about the evidential picture in relation to mammals.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was just the perfect introduction to this whole series. Okay, so let me just share my screen. And if any of you online would like to turn your camera on, I would like that because it gives me the feeling I'm talking to humans and not just my computer. So I set myself the challenge of asking what might seem a very obvious question. How do we know, because we often feel we know, that mammals and birds are sentient? And I want to emphasize that Jonathan has not seen or approved this message, but I'm very much hoping he likes it.
I'll let you know at the end.
I'm sure you will. So I'm sure most of you will just feel it's obvious that mammals and birds are sentient, especially if we live with them. So I, in my heart, know that my cat Sylvie loves me as much as I love her. But there are some counters to this. One is that us humans are just pre-programmed to detect intention, emotion, animation, even when it's not really there. Small children will be wrapped by cartoons of circles that look as though they're helping each other out, and obviously they're not really. We see faces in trees and sinks. We fall in love with chat box, and so it's possible that our conviction is just a delusion. The other issue is that it's not obvious to everyone, and so the Ontario Federation for Agriculture argued in 2020 that it's anthropomorphic to claim sentience in farm animals. Now, their stance wasn't well reasoned, and was really sort of political, but it's mirrored by skepticism from other quarters, as Jonathan introduced, that some neuroscientists, particularly mammalian neuroscientists like Ewan MacPhail and Edmund Rolls have argued that sentience is only very narrowly taxonomically distributed. And they argue this because of their understanding of the way in which so much of the brain and even the spine can generate remarkably flexible behavioral responses and even learning, as you heard. And their skepticism reminds us that many responses consistent with felt emotion are equally consistent with unaware, affect-free explanations. And the third reason for me to say, well, it's not that obvious, is that arguably, societally, it's not clear that we actually treat many mammals and birds as though they are actually sentient in a way that we take seriously. For example, Canada has essentially no nationwide animal welfare laws. And in the US, animals used in research, for example, are protected by the USDA Animal Welfare Act, but not if they're rodents, all 100 million of them, or not if they're birds and not if they're farm animals. And in both countries, and also beyond, very little protects vertebrates that are killed by poisons that take days to have their effect. So given this background, I'm going to focus on those birds and mammals that are deemed pests, that are intensively farmed, or that are widely used in biomedical research and testing. And these species largely fall into four orders: the rodents, artiodactyls or even-toed ungulates, galliforms and columbiforms within the birds. And I'm highlighting their taxonomic order because in pulling together evidence, I'm going to follow a really sensible, pragmatic rule of thumb that Jonathan's advocated in other contexts, that evidence for one species is enough to kind of cover that whole order. And so for birds, I'm not going to be talking about corvids and parrots because I'm going to assume that doesn't extend to galliforms or columbiforms because I want to be conservative, but I'm going to assume that evidence from quail species applies to chickens and turkeys and vice versa, that evidence from various species of pigeons apply to each other and so on. Likewise, in the mammals, I'm not going to use any evidence from primates or dogs because I'm going to assume for caution that that doesn't extend to rodents or even-toed ungulates, but I'm going to assume that, say, evidence from Norway rats will just apply to everyone in the rodentia and so on. I was pretty confident in this till last night when I suddenly realized that modern taxonomies actually include cetaceans within the Artiodactyla. This is due to molecular evidence. So I'm actually not going to follow this quite. I'm not going to be including cetacean data in my argument for Artiodactyl sentience because I'm going to be old-fashioned, have an old-fashioned view of that order. So what would convincing evidence for sentience look like? So focusing on conscious emotion, just because it's most studied. So this is responses to preferred or aversive stimuli in the world. Good evidence, as Jonathan beautifully described, can't easily be explained in other ways. So not by processes that are known to be non-conscious and not by clever looking but pre-programmed innate responses. And it should also map onto what we think are the apparent properties or likely functions of human consciousness being most well studied. And Jonathan beautifully outlined that this seems to be to do with things like behavioral flexibility and certain forms of learning. And various emotion researchers have tried to narrow this down a bit more. So here's a couple of examples here. When we look at humans, what do conscious emotions allow us to do? And I'm taking a functional stance that sentience allows us to do things that non-sentience doesn't. So Nico Frieda, for example, said that conscious emotions give us centralized representations of what are desirable or undesirable ends or goals or states, so that we can use flexible actions and plans to do whatever it takes to feel good and to do whatever it takes to avoid the bad things. 20 years later, Edmund Rolls kind of agreed. He argued that yes, conscious emotions allow us to generate, for example, multiple alternative ways to obtain a reward. But he argued that they have to do this to be deemed conscious by involving the recall or reflection on or reorganization of information about the self and the world using some kind of syntactical reasoning that involves understanding order and maybe even very low level language. So he sets the evidence bar higher in that he wouldn't take mere associative learning of any kind as evidence for conscious emotion. This doesn't make him right. It makes him at the end of the angry skeptics, as Jonathan described them. So let me give you a kind of everyday example of what conscious emotion might do for you. So if you had an intense abdominal pain, you might automatically grimace and change your posture and how you move. All of us do this. Doesn't need to indicate or involve consciousness at all, but there's a number of extra things we can do. These stereotypical pain responses we can actually modulate, so we can exaggerate them to get sympathy, or if we're an Italian soccer player, or we can hide them if we want to protect loved ones who are scared that our cancer's returned. We can also inspect the pain and do various things with this introspection. So we can describe it and we can report it in diverse learned ways that could involve writing or speaking or pointing at frowny faces on a sort of pain severity chart. We can also use our introception to decide what to do and flexibly take the appropriate action. So we can decide, do I need to take an anti-gas pill, or do I need to take an antacid, or am I 9 months pregnant and this is the start of this is the start of labor? We can take a number of actions that are appropriate based on introception, and we can use our recall of past pains to compare our current pain to decide, is this similar, is it better, or is it worse, how worried should I be, and what should I do? So this I'm sure makes intuitive sense, but how to operationalize these kind of extras, these extra abilities that sentience gives us in other species. So I'm going to review evidence of around the following: that other species do arbitrary operants to gain rewards or avoid punishers, that they show evidence of flexible goal-directedness in their bids to gain rewards or avoid punishers, and that they show evidence of introception. And all of these represent evolutionarily novel behaviors that an individual can display ad hoc to best get them out of trouble in a new situation. Now I'm going to go over the first and last of these because they might need a bit of explanation. So simple operant learning, why on earth? We see it all the time. Animals will learn a new behavior to get a reward or avoid a punisher. Why consider this as a candidate? Well, partly because as far as we know, though we're lacking research on this topic, you can't do this without conscious awareness of the reward or punisher. It exemplifies flexibility and it leads to evolutionarily new responses. I would say operant learning is particularly persuasive when the response is unlike anything seen in nature, so it can't be pre-programmed, and when the reward is not like anything seen in nature either. But this wouldn't particularly convince Edmund Roald, for example. What about introception? So I want to talk here about using internal states as discriminative stimuli, which sounds a bit jargony, but in a way is quite simple, and it's literally just what I told you about now in the case of the person feeling pain. If you're feeling pain, you use your state of pain to select which of a number of learned responses is most appropriate. Do I need to take a drug? In which case, which drug do I select? Or do I need to go to the hospital bag as bought from Etsy? Or do I need to call 911 and get an ambulance? And animals too can use their internal states as so-called discriminative stimuli in operant tasks. So let me talk you through how this works. So an animal can be trained that in an operant apparatus where it has two potential ways to gain a reward, an animal can be trained that if, for example, there are two levers, but only one ever works to deliver food, which one delivers food can be made contingent on the animal's internal state. And this is controlled by the experimenter, who will modify the animal's internal state and then correspondingly make either the right hand or the left hand lever work. And the animal has to figure this out. And presumably they can only do this by introspection, would go the argument. This reminds me, I do need to apologize that some of the work I'm going to present is quite nasty. It goes back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and some of the standards are far lower than I think we'd want to see for animals. Okay, so this kind of research where animals where the control of animals' operant responding is hitched to internal discriminative stimuli, has shown, for example, that primates can tell you by which lever they push whether or not their small intestine is being pulsated by a small balloon. And many species have been shown to be able to discriminate between a variety of psychoactive drugs or being given an injection of saline. There's thousands of studies here on 11 species, including humans. Now, the human data show us that when people are exposed to drug versus saline discriminations like this task, as a rule, people can only discriminate types of drugs that have subjective felt effects. And for those drugs, they can typically only discriminate doses that are high enough to induce subjective effects. Though sometimes people manage to do this without apparently any subjective experience, leaving the door open to perhaps some blind sight like guessing playing a role too. Okay, so what do we know about the rodentia? And I'm going to focus here on data from the rat. So we know that rats and many other rodents will learn arbitrary operants to do things like avoid electric shock, gain food rewards, and also learn a variety of operants to gain novel rewards such as, oops, I'm jumping ahead of myself, recreational drugs and electrical brain stimulation to parts of the brain that in us help us feel states of pleasure. And even when rodents are just working for regular old food, clever experiments involving rewards devaluation have shown that their operant responses are goal-directed, they're not mere habits. And we also know that rats can learn a novel operant simply by watching other rats do a complicated operant task. So they don't have to just get there always by trial and error. They do seem goal-directed. Now, in some of these tasks where animals perform operants to gain drugs, sometimes these drugs are analgesics. And when rodents self-administer analgesics by operant responding, they do so in a remarkably state-dependent way. And what I mean by this, excuse me, is that rats who are induced to be in a state of arthritis work much harder for pain control than rats like the top one, whose paws are regular and presumably don't hurt. Furthermore, within the rats who have arthritis, this self-administration can be reduced by pre-infusing with opiates or pre-dosing animals with anti-inflammatory drugs that successfully tackle the swelling. So this seems remarkably consistent with the animal inspecting their state of pain and performing operants in an adaptive way to reduce that pain. As further evidence of this type of introspection, many studies show that rats can use their internal states as discriminative stimuli in operant tasks like these. So for example, hungry rats in a test chamber where they have to learn which of two levers will generate food can learn that which lever works will depend on whether they've been given saline or a psychoactive drug. As I mentioned, hundreds of studies here. But not only that, they can learn which lever will work depends on what they last did, what their own action was, when they were last fed, so whether they're feeling very food deprived or only mildly so, whether they're hungry or thirsty, or even whether or not they've been through drug withdrawal. Now, a pedant might argue that this just reflects blind sight-like guessing, but there's further evidence that this really does reflect true interoception. For a start, rats show state-dependent changes in their ability to use drugs as discriminative stimuli. And furthermore, rats generalize from drugs they've been trained on to drugs which arguably have very similar subjective effects. So let me give you examples of both of these. So rats show state-dependent changes in their ability to use certain drugs as discriminative stimuli. So I want you to imagine that someone gives you a pill and asks you to say whether or not it's an Advil. Now, if you had no aches or pains, I think you'd find that an impossible discrimination to make. But if you had a headache, you could take the pill and answer the question in about 15 minutes' time. And it seems as though rats are similar. So in a task where rats were trained that if they're infused with saline, one lever gives them a reward. If they're infused with aspirin, another lever will give them a reward. Healthy rats find this quite hard, and they only pick the aspirin lever in about 60% of trials. But again, rats given arthritis in this terrible way found the task much easier. They picked the correct lever 70% of the trials, as though they can detect pain relief much better when they are in a state of pain. And there are similar studies too. So conversely, rats find it easier to use pain as a discriminative stimulus if they're not given an analgesic. On top of this, rats generalize from the drug they've been trained on to other events that very arguably have similar subjective effects. Use the typo there. And they'll, for example, generalize between drugs that feel similar to us, even though the mode of action is very similar. So rats trained to use caffeine as a discriminative stimulus, but then given a very low dose of amphetamine, which is another stimulant, will then press the caffeine lever for food, not the saline lever. And they don't do this for other drugs. They're not showing, oh, I feel a bit weird. They're showing, I feel stimulated. Rats trained to use being hungover from alcohol withdrawal as a DS will also pick the hangover lever for food if they're put through morphine withdrawal. Quite different mode of action, but subjectively an extremely unpleasant experience, just like a bad hangover is, and rats seem to be reporting it or categorizing it similarly. And these types of generalizations extend even beyond drug experiences. So, for example, rats trained to use an anxiety-provoking drug called PTZ, pentylene tetrazole, will then pick the PTZ lever for food if they're exposed to electric shock or if they're exposed to a cat. And I've put PTZ in red here because I want you to remember it. Okay, so extrapolating from rats to rodents, I'd say we have very, very, very strong evidence that rodents are sentient. I think this is as simply as good as it can be without rodents telling us, I feel happy, I feel in pain. Ironically, much of these data reflect some of the really terrible things that have been done to rodents, but I think they make it vanishingly unlikely that rodents are non-sentient. Okay, so what do we know about artiodactyls? And I'm going to focus here on data from cattle, goats, and pigs. So we know that these species can learn to perform arbitrary operants for very unusual rewards. So here in lovely work from Denmark, a dairy cow is showing us that she will push a panel indicated with the arrow by her nose in order to have a strap release that will allow her to lie down. You can see she's kind of suspended. She can't lie down unless she pushes a panel with her nose. Pigs will do all kinds of clever operants, including pressing a button with their nose in order to get electrical stimulation in parts of the brain we think cause pleasure, and they will also self-administer psychoactive or recreational drugs too. What about other evidence of flexible strategies to get rewards? Artiodactyls can learn by watching others or watching an apparatus and figuring out how it can lead them to get food. So here is an example where pigs were presented with a puzzle box in which they have to slide a button to one side, and then they have to lift out a button and then slide a slidey thing in order to get to a treat within. And in this recent research, pigs knew that this box contained food. They were presented with it, with the box open, and they were able to gobble up a snack. Half the pigs were then shown how this puzzle box works in a number of different ways. They could have another pig as a demonstrator, a human could show them, various artificial devices could just lift the plug and slide the thing as if by magic. And this could happen with an untrained demonstrator as well. And what the researchers found is that all the pigs who could watch how this apparatus worked were more successful in solving the task compared to non-observers. It didn't matter how they saw the box's secrets being unraveled, it just mattered that they saw it. So what this means is they can solve a problem that will lead to a reward without trial and error operant learning. It also seems they can seek alternative strategies when they're needed. And this is a lovely study from Christian Narot and colleagues. So in this work, goats were trained initially that if they moved this plastic box, they would discover the delicious treat of dry pasta, which apparently they like a lot. And in the training phase, goats learned this very quickly. Now, a human was always sitting close by, and in the training phase, goats never looked at the human. In the test trials, the box was then glued down so that no matter what they did, they couldn't get at the pasta treat. And in this test phase, goats repeatedly looked at the person, alternating between looking at the person and looking at the problem, as if they recognized that humans are an alternative way in which they manage to get food. And some of the goats went beyond alternating and really looked as though they were trying to find an alternative strategy to get the treat that they were being denied. Okay, what about true introspection? So pigs have been shown to be able to use their internal states as discriminative stimuli. Only one drug has been tested, and this is PTZ, this powerfully anxiogenic compound. And pigs were shown to be able to learn that one response would give them food when they were given this drug, another response would give them food when they were just given saline, and their differential responses showed that they successfully learned this task. So does this show true introspection? Further evidence consistent with that. Now, I have to say the sample sizes in this work are tiny, the stats are pretty horrible, but nevertheless, they're all we've got and they are quite convincing. In 4 pigs who were trained to discriminate PTZ, if they were then exposed to electric shock, they would then press the PTZ lever and not the saline lever, as though being shocked and being rendered anxious by a drug have something in common. And in another study, 1 out of 4 pigs picked the PTZ response lever after hearing a dog bark. 1 out of 3 did so after being driven round and round in a truck, and 2 out of 4 did so after exposure to a strange pig. So all very consistent with generalizing between states that feel subjectively similar. So I would say, given their flexible strategies to obtain rewards and their abilities to introspect the effects of an anxiogenic drug and generalize from it to electric shock, this is very strong evidence of sentience. I don't think we can plausibly argue that they're not sentient. Okay, turning to birds very quickly. So the columbiforms, I'm going to focus on data from the common pigeon, often used in laboratory research. And these pigeons can, again, learn a variety of novel operants. They can learn to peck discs, press a treadle with their foot, or raise their head in a particular way to avoid electric shock. They can learn to peck for electrical brain stimulation, being stimulated in brain regions that often make them coo and fan their tails as though they're courting, and they will also peck for infusions of cocaine. Now, pigeons are also remarkable navigators, as you'll know from their use in kind of homing competitions. And since the 1960s, people have been studying their amazingly resilient and flexible navigation. They can get home if you take them thousands of kilometers away, if you mess around with landmarks, if you destroy their sense of smell, if you put magnets on their beak. Does this meet Rawls's criteria for conscious emotion? Does it prove they really love being at home? I'm convinced. I don't know if he would be, but let's look at some laboratory data that might be a bit more effective. Pigeons can learn novel operants to get food, like the rats, simply by watching other birds do a complex operant. In other words, they can do some basic problem solving in order to get rewards without resorting to trial and error learning. Pigeons can also discriminate being injected with saline from being given THC, amphetamine, a host of opioids, and many other drugs, sometimes even 4 at once. So pigeons are fantastic at introspection, and sometimes they can be trained to distinguish between 4 different drugs and pick the corresponding lever. It's really incredible. On top of this, They can even use their own recent behavior as a discriminative stimulus, pecking a different disc for food based on whether they recently pecked or not, which I think gives them more abilities than I have, I think. And it seems like true introspection in that they generalize between diverse drugs that feel similar to us. And like us in the rats, they show state-dependent changes in discrimination, here shown for their ability to detect benzodiazepines. So in humans, a pre-existing state of anxiety or fear enhances the subjective effects of benzodiazepines, which reduce anxiety. And very similarly, pigeons can discriminate this anxiolytic. They can discriminate this anxiolytic drug from saline, but they do so much more easily if they were recently exposed to electric shock or a loud noise. So incredibly resonant with human behavior. So I would say there's even stronger evidence here than for the artiodactyls. And the benzodiazepine study, I have to say, I actually found quite upsetting because it really puts into context all the other horrible studies that I've been reading on pigeons. Now, turning to the galliforms, and this will be short. Data here come from quail and from chickens. We've known since the time of the Brellans that chickens can perform arbitrary operants. We also know that chicks will peck for electrical brain stimulation that induces calls associated with the mother and food. We know that hens' learned food-getting behavior is goal-directed through clever reward devaluation work. And we know that they can be very flexible in their food-obtaining behavior. They can show impulse control. They can once again learn operant tasks by observing other hens. This is fantastic work on quails. And chickens can use food signals in a context-sensitive, referent way. But that is pretty much it for galliforms. Unless I just expand the envelope of what I deem useful and look at a Pavlovian response that does seem state-dependent. So in one beautiful study from Christine Nichols' lab, hens with or without keelbone fractures were given the opportunity to learn about an association associated with being given opioids. And hens without fractures didn't seem to learn this discrimination. Hens with fractures, consistent with being painful, did seem to learn this discrimination, but they were not very good at it. Out of 7 trials, the healed fracture hens chose the opiate-associated location only on average 4.5 times out of 7. That's all we have. So I'm most doubtful for the galliforms, but I really think this reflects a really remarkable lack of evidence. They can flexibly seek reward for sure, but we're missing a ton of evidence about negative states. And I really think we need more studies that don't induce states, but capitalize on the many hens out there that already have fractured bones that maybe could show us whether or not they can self-report pain or analgesia in discriminative stimulus studies. So what's the evidence then that mammals and birds are sentient? Just the strongest you could get for rodents, pretty damn impressive for artiodactyls, remarkably strong for the pigeons and their relatives. Pretty convincing, but it would be nice to see more for the pigeons and for the chickens and their relatives. And so what this journey has sparked in my mind is many questions, several of which Jonathan has raised, and which you'll hear echoed in the talks that follow in this series. Which markers are the most credible? Was the bar I set too high? What standards of evidence do we need? What shapes what we regard as compelling and the best explanation? Our training, our conflict of interests, our fear of unintended consequences, and is the one species cover an order rule always sensible? So I want to thank the people who helped field some random questions from me. That's Christian, Heather, Liz, and Pat Turner, the members of the GTA Animal Cognition Group, whose imaginary criticisms I hear all the time, and of course, Jonathan, for being such an inspiration. Our next two talks will be on the case for and against sentience in fish, in which you will see all the complexities we've dealt with today, even more magnified, because fish are so very different from us humans. Okay, thanks very much. So there is time for questions.